What if time isn't a straight road, but a circle drawn in ink, quietly waiting to be read? What if a monk, forgotten by empires, buried by dynasties, once saw our future clearer than we see our own present? Tonight, we unroll a mystery not just ancient, but awakening. It begins in the Tang Dynasty, over 1,000 years ago, where a silent monk named Hongju penned 14 short verses, cryptic, poetic, and, for centuries, ignored. He wasn't a king, nor a conqueror. He wore no crown, only humility, but in his scrolls, sealed in cedar and dust, he described events no mortal of his time should have known. Dynasties rising and falling, wars yet to be fought, and a final warning, etched not in fear, but in fire. 12 of his verses have already come true. One eerily echoed the 2020 pandemic, centuries before patient zero. But it's the 14th verse that stops scholars cold. A prophecy set in 2025. Now, we stand just beyond its shadow. Before we begin, if you're drawn to forbidden histories, lost prophecies, and mysteries that refuse to die like this video, subscribe to the channel and tap the bell icon so you don't miss what comes next. Some warnings vanish with time. Others grow louder, because if his words were right, then what happens next isn't just history waiting to unfold. It's destiny demanding an answer. So light your lantern. The scroll begins. More than 1,000 years ago, during China's luminous Tang Dynasty, where poetry flowed like jade wine and emperors dressed in moonlight and lacquered power, there walked a man who sought neither praise nor throne. He was called Hongju. His name, softly spoken, meant vast stillness. But the silence he carried was anything but empty. Legends say he wandered barefoot through imperial gardens, robes stained by ink and autumn wind, ignored by courtiers and feared by those who sensed his eyes saw something more, something beyond. Hongju lived far from the political heart of China. He chose isolation over influence, silence over speech. Deep in a remote monastery, far from war drums and silk banners, he meditated beneath oil lamps until the wicks surrendered. There, in the hush between heartbeats, he saw things, not dreams, not madness, but crystalline visions of cities, crumbling under red banners, of smoke choking once silent valleys, of years numbered in plague and fire. He never sought attention, but history, it seems, came looking for him. One autumn, the young crown prince Li Longji visited the monastery to receive a monk's blessing. Custom demanded incense and deference, but Hongju broke ritual. He raised his staff and struck the prince across the face. Gasps echoed through the temple like shattered porcelain. That one act should have meant execution. And yet, years later, when Li Longji became Emperor Xuanzong, he didn't kill Hongju. Instead, he gave him a title, the rude monk, and ordered his teachings transcribed onto silk scrolls and locked in a cedar archive. Inside, beyond sutras and verses on stillness, were 14 short poems. Odd things, veiled in sun and serpent, fire and lotus. Many dismissed them as philosophy wrapped in metaphor. But centuries would peel those metaphors apart until history bled through. What if they weren't poems at all, but a map of time? The poems were sealed for centuries, stitched into silk, pressed in cedar, and buried in dust. No one expected them to mean anything beyond philosophy until they started coming true. One by one, the verses began to echo, softly at first, like ripples on still water. But as time moved forward, they rose, like thunder. Scholars began comparing the stanzas to events that had already unfolded, and what they found was chilling. Let us begin with the first prophecy, a verse that read, "Twin lights torn from the heavens, crimson smoke winding the palace beams." For generations, it was thought to be abstract, even beautiful. But in hindsight, it captured the death throes of the Ming Dynasty with eerie precision. The dynasty's emblem bore the symbols of the sun and moon, two celestial lights. But in 1644, both were extinguished in flame and betrayal. Li Zicheng's peasant army breached Beijing's gates, the capital burned, and the last Ming emperor, in despair, hung himself from a catalpa tree in the palace garden. His final words, never written on paper, only whispered, dispersed in ash on the wind. The verse was no longer metaphor. It was a match struck in prophecy. The second verse spoke of the radiant child who binds dragons with ribbon, who rules for 61 autumns. At first glance, it made little sense. But history delivered a perfect mirror in the form of Emperor Kangxi, who ascended the Qing throne at just 8 years old. 4 regents ruled in his name until Kangxi, still a teenager, plotted in secret. Over a single night of silence and strategy, he seized control. No blood spilled, only quiet arrests in tea house. The dragon, the empire, was now in the grip of a child. He ruled for exactly 61 years, leading with wisdom and strength. Another verse had found its heartbeat in history. The third and fourth verses, known as the peak and the wither, were twin reflections, yin and yang. They spoke of a lotus blooming from jade waters, then fading to bone. These verses perfectly paralleled the era of Qianlong, grandson of Kangxi. Under him, China reached new heights. Territory expanded, the arts flourished, and silver flowed like rivers. Yet beneath the embroidered silks and grand palaces, rot festered. Corruption seeped into every corridor. Qianlong abdicated but clung to power behind the throne. The lotus that had bloomed began to wither. The fifth verse roared, the heavy red dragon coils upon itself and forgets to rise. A cryptic line until you look at the year 1796, a fire dragon year in the Chinese zodiac. This was when Emperor Jiaqing inherited a bloated empire collapsing under its own weight. The White Lotus Rebellion exploded across provinces, and worse, opium began to corrupt the bloodstream of a nation. The once mighty dragon now slithered, sluggishly dulled by excess. The sixth verse whispered a brief but piercing image. Smoke over jade waters, fragrant leaves turned to poison, foreign sails like severed wings. It could only mean one thing, the First Opium War. In 1839, Commissioner Lin Zexu burned 20,000 chests of British opium at Canton. The smoke was thick, scented, tragic. British warships retaliated, and soon jade waters ran red. Hongju's severed wings were the Chinese junks shattered by cannon fire. His imagery precise, yet poetic, like history told in metaphor. With these 6 fulfilled, scholars still hesitated. Perhaps, they said, coincidence. But then came the next 6 verses, and doubt died quietly. The 7th verse spoke of yellow turbines flooding the plains. This was no longer poetic, it matched the mechanical flood of the Taiping Rebellion, and later Yellow River flooding intensified by man-made dams and failed engineering. Nature and rebellion, both unleashed with unnatural force. The 8th and 9th verses told of iron dragons snarling across rivers, and steel flowers blooming where rice once lay. Railways, foreign-built and foreign-owned, crisscross China, symbols of imperial control. Land was no longer for farmers but for steam and steel. Then came the 10th verse. The red star, bowed by twin storms, stumbles but endures. The interpretation became clear. China, marked by its red emblem, was ravaged by 2 massive wars: the Sino-Japanese War and World War II. Hongju's twin storms became bombers over Nanjing, invasion forces. Through Shanghai and famine in the wake of conflict. The red star bent, but did not break. The 11th prophecy arrived with terrifying clarity. The monkey seizes heaven with steel wings. To the modern eye, it reads like science fiction. But to those who understand the zodiac, it's unmistakable. 1949, the Year of the Monkey, marks the founding of the People's Republic of China. Chairman Mao, called by many the Monkey King in whisper and rumor, rose to power through revolution, and his rule reached beyond Earth with the later birth of China's space program. Steel wings indeed. By the time historians reached the 12th verse, a chill had settled across even the most skeptical minds. 12 verses, 12 major moments, from dynasty to downfall, rebellion to rebirth, and each one aligned, not approximately, not vaguely, but uncannily. The 13th and 14th verses are not yet complete. One has begun. One lies in wait. The 13th whispers of a rat, a veil, and a global silence. The year was 2020, and when the world came to a halt, when cities fell quiet and markets trembled, scholars returned to Hongju scrolls and found the lines already written. One more verse remains, one prophecy yet to be fulfilled. It names no emperor, no dynasty, only a snake and a compass tilting. It names a year, 2025, and we are standing on its doorstep. The scroll had spoken 12 times. Each verse, once shrouded in allegory, had revealed its truth through the lens of history. Dynasties had risen and fallen under its ink. But after the 12th prophecy, the parchment fell silent until, recently, then something stirred. The 13th verse, long dismissed as too vague, too strange, suddenly began to shimmer with terrifying clarity. Read, "When the rat carries a widow's veil across the earth, the marketplaces shall fall silent, and choirs shall drown in cloth." It was just poetry, they said, just symbolism, until the year of the rat arrived, 2020. A microscopic shadow crossed the world, invisible yet all-consuming. Cities dimmed like dying stars. Airports emptied. Stock markets shivered. Supermarkets were stripped bare. And the word pandemic returned to headlines in a way no one had felt in a century. COVID-19 was the widow's veil. Mourning stretched across nations. The virus moved silently, like a rat in the walls of civilization, eroding normalcy without ceremony. Streets once vibrant fell mute. Mosques, temples, churches each closed their gates. No incense, no chants, no choirs, only silence muffled beneath masks. And there it was, in a scroll over 1,000 years old, the veil, the silence, the cloth. Historians and skeptics alike paused. What they had once scoffed at now stared back with a quiet authority. A Tang monk, sitting in a dark monastery, centuries before germ theory, had described with eerie precision the spiritual stillness, the economic halt, and the global grief that blanketed 2020. And yet, that verse was not a full stop. It was a comma, because the prophecy didn't end with the veil, it ended with a warning. When the snake coils next, the compass tilts. South rises in the west, and all rivers seek their source. The snake comes in 2025, the next year in the Chinese zodiac cycle. So the question hangs in the air, was 2020 the beginning of the end? Or the beginning of a choice? The widow's veil has passed, but now, the snake stirs beneath the earth, and with it, the final verse waits to strike. An ancient Tang monk sits in a shadowed monastery, his silhouette illuminated only by the flickering light of a dying oil lamp. Behind him, an unfurled scroll glows with ethereal Chinese calligraphy. Below the scroll, the earth hangs suspended, one half cloaked in a black widow's veil, the other cracking open as a serpentine shadow coils beneath its crust. A golden compass tilts unnaturally westward, trembling, while rivers around the globe flow backwards, toward glowing, unknown sources. In the distance, a faint sunrise bleeds from the south, rising where it shouldn't. The monk remains still, eyes closed, but his final verse burns in gold ink above. When the snake coils next, the compass tilts. Style: cinematic dark realism with surreal mythological undertones. Color palette: deep indigo, burning gold, serpent green, and funeral black. But the ancient Chinese calendar gives us the first key. The next year of the snake falls in 2025, just ahead. If Hongju's past accuracy is any guide, then this line isn't metaphor. It's a countdown. The snake, to Chinese thinkers, is layered with meaning. Patient, precise, unseen until it strikes. It waits not idly, but deliberately, coiled beneath stone, beneath assumptions. And when it moves, it does so with intent. So what exactly is coiling beneath our world right now? Could it be geopolitical? A power shift long in motion but suddenly visible? The compass tilts. South rises in the west. Scholars interpret this as a poetic code for reversal, an inversion of dominance. Where once the global north dictated culture, finance, and influence, the global south, nations in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, now asserts itself in economics, climate negotiations, even military influence. Policies once whispered in Western capitals now face defiance or redirection. Others believe it hints at something far older than politics. All rivers seek their source. It's a spiritual phrase, an invitation for humanity to return to something long abandoned, a kind of inner reckoning. Maybe it speaks of values, balance, humility, connection, a return to a forgotten center, not in geography but in consciousness. Yet not all interpretations are hopeful. Some see this final stanza as the darkest of all, a cataclysm that coils silently in algorithms, in fractured alliances, in climate extremes waiting to breach thresholds. The compass tilting could mean disorientation, nations lost in political upheaval, economies realigned through force, not reform, and rivers seeking their source? Perhaps migration on an epic scale, driven by collapse, not peace. The beauty and terror of prophecy is its flexibility. Hongju gave us no instructions, only symbols. And now, with 2025 drawing near, the symbols awaken. The snake is stirring. The compass needle trembles. And we are being watched by a scroll that may already know how this ends. Hongju's final prophecy leaves us at the edge of something. Not a destination, but a fork in the path. A moment just before the world inhales or breaks. When the snake coils next, the compass tilts. South rises in the west. All rivers seek their source. We stand in the hush between those lines. And around us, 3 doors creak open, each offering a different vision of what 2025 could become. Door 1, geopolitical reversal, the compass tilts. This interpretation views Hongju's prophecy through the lens of power and empire. The compass tilting is no small phrase, it signals a shift in the axis of global influence. For centuries, the world's power rotated around the Western Hemisphere, first Europe, then the United States. Trade routes, cultural exports, political systems, and financial institutions were all shaped by this Western dominance. But now, the global South rises, economically, culturally, and politically. India becomes the world's most populous nation. African nations, once seen only through lenses of aid and crisis, begin shaping tech, energy, and policy. Latin America asserts autonomy in diplomacy, energy, and digital governance. Door 2, spiritual awakening, all rivers seek their source. Some interpret the verse not politically, but personally. What if the rivers represent us? Our thoughts, our values, our relationships? What if seeking the source means a return to what we've lost, not in location but in spirit? The pandemic pulled humanity into isolation. In that silence, many looked inward. Mindfulness apps surged. Therapy became normalized. Practices once seen as esoteric became mainstream. Meditation, plant-based living, regenerative farming, quiet revolutions spread like roots beneath the surface. This door suggests that 2025 isn't a collapse, but a turning inward. A year where enough people seek balance, stillness, and reconnection, tipping the species into a gentler phase. Perhaps the snake represents not a predator but Kundalini energy awakening from within. Not the end of the world, but the beginning of a new way of seeing it. Imagine a world where technology serves contemplation, not distraction. Where economic models begin rewarding regeneration over extraction. Where nations compete not for dominance but for well-being. Idealistic? Perhaps. But all revolutions begin as impossible thoughts whispered until they become ordinary. This door isn't loud. It doesn't flash. But it calls to the part of us that still believes change doesn't have to be violent to be real. Door 3, controlled collapse, the snake strikes. And then, there's the final door, the one with rusted hinges and a colder wind. Some say the snake is not spiritual, not symbolic, but lethal. A warning of coiled disasters long building. Conflict, resource scarcity, cyber warfare, ecological collapse. The compass tilting means a world thrown off its axis, not by enlightenment but by upheaval. Under this view, south rising in the west refers to climate migration, millions displaced by drought, storms, and rising seas moving northward into nations already strained. Political tensions erupt, borders tighten, supply chains fracture further, and rivers seeking their source? Not peaceful return, but forced consolidation. Centralized controls, digital walls, data hoarding, power grids sabotaged, the internet weaponized, a global retreat into survivalism, control, and suspicion. This future doesn't announce itself with explosions. It seeps in through spreadsheets, treaties, and algorithms. Then, one day, the world realizes it has narrowed. Everything feels smaller, meaner. The snake has struck, not with fangs, but with systems. It's a world where the prophecy isn't read. It's felt. In grocery prices, in blackouts, in headlines full of denials that sound more like confessions. Each door is possible. Each is already whispering in headlines, heat waves, and human instincts. And perhaps that's what makes Hongju's prophecy so powerful. He didn't trap us in fate. He mirrored our choices. Back at us. His verses don't say what will happen. They ask, which story are you writing right now? Prophecies are often misunderstood. We think of them as traps, unchangeable scripts delivered from some distant, divine authority. But what if they're not chains, but mirrors? Hongju never claimed certainty. He didn't name specific rulers or declare inevitable destruction. He wrote in symbols, in suggestions, in echoes. His power wasn't prediction, it was perception. He saw the rhythm of history, the rise, the rot, the rebirth, and he offered us glimpses, not of a future etched in stone, but of one waiting to be shaped. That's what makes the final verse so haunting. It doesn't tell us what 2025 will be. It shows us what it could become, depending on how we choose to respond. The snake coils, the compass tilts, the rivers remember. It's not a warning, it's a question. Will we recoil into fear and survivalism, or evolve into something deeper, more balanced? Will we allow old structures to collapse violently, or gently dismantle what no longer serves? Will we return to the same mistakes, or remember a wiser path? The prophecy reflects our collective state of mind. A fearful mind sees doom. An arrogant one sees nothing at all. But a humble mind, a curious, awake mind asks, what am I being asked to see? To change? To choose? In that sense, Hongju didn't dictate the future. He handed us the mirror and walked away. So now we stand here at the threshold of 2025. The snake is beginning to stir. The compass trembles. And the rivers are listening. Whether Hongju truly saw the future or simply understood humanity's repeating heartbeats, one truth remains. We are not powerless. We are the authors of the final verse. We decide if it's written in ash or in light. The scroll may be ancient, but its message is timeless. Beware the cycles we refuse to break. Honor the paths we choose to create. If the story stirred something in you, a question, a fear, a strange sense of familiarity, don't let it vanish with the scroll's final line. Leave your thoughts in the comments below. What future do you see coming? And if you believe stories like this matter, tales where myth and reality blur, and history speaks across centuries like this video, subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss the next mystery waiting just beyond the veil. The scroll closes, but the story has just begun.